When I lived in La Quinta, California around 2002, I was sitting on my bed talking with a friend when I saw something run into the hall bathroom. I went to look around. My friend and I saw a dark, grayish, 3-foot thing that was hunched over, long arms, very cranky looking, opening the bathroom cabinet under the sink. It was as if he was looking for something, and it was very angry about it. This thing, I believe, was a troll. It looked over at me, and I said, "Hey, what the heck?" It slammed the door, and in a flash it took off. My friend heard the slam and asked what it was. I just said, "I don't think you want to know." I had been seeing a dark thing run past every now and then, but I took it as it was my dog, which is a black chow. I now know it was not my dog. I had at least a good 30 seconds to look at this thing. It really tripped me out. I've been seeing things in the paranormal world since I was about 5 years old that I can remember. I've had tests done to reassure myself that I'm not crazy. I would sometimes wish that I was crazy, considering the things that I've been through. It occurred in the year 1989 in Crockett, California. Just like most old homes in town, we lived in a very old house, over 80 years old. I was 11 years old in 1989. My older sister frequently had stories of scary paranormal incidents in the house, but I honestly never believed her. So one night in 1989, I was trying to go to sleep in my room. I was having trouble falling asleep. I really didn't feel tired at all. I was semi-unconsciously tapping a rhythmic beat on the side of my metal bed frame. All of a sudden it dawned on me that I could hear the same beat in the wall on the opposite side of the bed. Not thinking anything weird yet, I stopped my tapping, and the same rhythmic tapping continued from the wall. I still wasn't scared. Honestly, the tapping incident all happened so fast, I didn't have time to process it. It is what happened next that terrified me. As soon as I realized the tapping was continuing in the wall and it wasn't for me, I turned my head and was facing my deep walk-in closet. In the back of the closet was a small man-like creature. He had beady black eyes and a beard. He was probably 2 feet tall. I didn't stick around to take a closer look. I ran as fast as I could, screaming from my room. I was never a kid who had nightmares or needed to sleep with my mommy. It wasn't like I was a little kid anymore. I was 11 years old when this happened. I have honestly never been so terrified in my life. That man was there. I saw him. After calming me down, my mom went into my bedroom, checked out the closet, said nothing was there, and closed and locked the door. My mom convinced me that I saw an illusion, and it was the end of it. About 4 years later, I was writing an essay about the experience for my high school English class. As we were driving in the car, I reminded my mother of that night in 1989. My mom just looked over at me and told me if she had seen the man too. She saw what I saw. She said she just couldn't believe it was true and thought it had to be something else. So she just closed and locked the door. It was a relief to know that I wasn't crazy that night, because I knew I wasn't half asleep or just seeing things. But then again, I had tried to convince myself that I had been wrong about that man. It was quite scary all over again to realize that in the bedroom that I slept every night had once upon a time had a paranormal creature watching me and trying to communicate with me. As an adult, I started reading a book about demonic possessions. On page 8 of the book, it discussed how demons frequently engage children in communicating with them through knocking on walls. I literally threw the book and never picked it up again. I'm not a big paranormal buff. Was there a demon in my closet? Gnome? Elf? Just an illusion? I don't know, but that's my story. It was a warm summer's day in August of 1978 when a Toronto area man had an experience with a strange creature that would forever change his life. Ernest, he would only allow his first name to be used, was a soft-spoken 51-year-old at the time of his harrowing experience. He and his wife of 19 years had been raising a litter of kittens. One of the kittens apparently disappeared, and Ernest decided to search for it in the vicinity of their Parliament Street apartment. Close by, he stumbled upon an opening to a dark cave and crawled approximately 10 feet inwards. This is where he said, "I saw a living nightmare that I'll never forget." Armed with only a flashlight, Ernest encountered a creature of unknown origin. He described the monster as long and thin, almost like a monkey. 3 feet long, large teeth, weighing maybe 30 pounds with slate gray fur. However, it was the eyes that truly stood out. Orange and red, slanted. Ernest spoke reluctantly with reporters as to what had occurred next. The creature spoke to him. "I'll never forget it," he said. It said, "Go away, go away." in a hissing voice. Then it took off down a long tunnel off to the side. I got out of there as fast as I could. I was shaking with fear. Ernest never approached the media with this story. He was afraid that people would think he was drunk, or worse, crazy, and felt no one would believe him. The Toronto Sun newspaper found him after hearing about his experience from a reliable contact who worked with a relative of Ernest, one of a handful of people whom he had confided the experience. He would agree to talk only if his last name was not revealed.
I believe Ernie saw exactly what he says he did,
said Barbara, Ernest's wife.
He was terrified when he came back to the apartment, and he doesn't scare easily. Look, he's been known to have a drink in the past, like most people, and to occasionally tie one on, but he's not a drunk, and he wasn't drinking at all that day.
The Toronto Sun did question some of Ernest's relatives and neighborhood acquaintances. They found that they all agreed with and supported Barbara's evaluation of her husband. Ernest, accompanied by the Sun staff, returned to the location of his strange sighting in March of 1979. The cave's entrance was located at the bottom of a narrow passageway between the buildings where he lived and the one next door. Together, they found the corpse of a cat, which was half buried in the tunnel. The sad discovery reminded Ernest of strange noises, like animals in pain, that he had heard emanating from the tunnel prior to his frightening encounter. Ernest showed the Sun reporter exactly where he saw the strange being. He stated, "The last I saw the creature, it was heading off into the dark." The passage seemed to drop down very quickly and go a long way back. It was speculated that the tunnel in fact led to the sewer system, and that the entranceway besides Ernest's apartment was an access point used by the creature to the surface. Safety concerns promoted Toronto's sewer department to thoroughly inspect the tunnel, as it was feared that area children may in fact enter it. Ernest's story was very strange. However, sewage employees did not ridicule or scoff at it, according to the report made by the Toronto Sun at the time. One worker who was quoted in the paper stated, "People who work in the surface just don't know what it's like down there. It's a whole different world. Who would have thought a few years ago that people would live in the sewers, and yet that's what they found in New York a few years back." Another was quoted as saying, "I don't know what Ernest saw down there." He also stated, "I'll tell you one thing, if we could get in there, I sure as hell wouldn't want to go down there alone." I live in Australia and wonder if anyone has heard of the wood aji. I learned of them a few years ago when relating a story to a Noongar friend of mine. Noongars are the main Aboriginal tribe of Australia's southwest, and in their lore the wood aji are mischievous, sometimes violent little people. My encounter happened in Perth, in the suburb of Coolongup, in the 1980s, when I was about 6 years old. My brother, cousins, and I were playing in the Blackboy bushland, and I was hiding from them. I heard a rustling noise to my right and looked over to see a small Aboriginal man about 10 feet away from me. He was about 13 inches tall with a bushy beard and wearing nothing but a loincloth. I assumed he was hunting as he had a spear notched to his woomera, a spear-throwing tool, and I might have disturbed him. He looked at me with angry eyes and threw his spear, which sank into my foot before he, the spear, and the hole in my foot vanished. Only the Noongars believe me. In the autumn of AD 6, Tiberius's forces were camped to the southwest bank of a concourse which in the future would be named the Elbe, or Elf Women. The Romans were approximately 200 kilometers south of the North Sea. In Tiberius's own journal we read, "The area was rich in forest, fish, and game, but also for the past 2 days a region eerily quiet, almost as if nature itself were awaiting someone to utter a command." On the third day of their encampment, the dawn of which Tiberius had planned to move across the Elbe, having refreshed his force with food and much-needed rest, without warning, a clarion from the northeastern shore of the Elbe at the location was heard by several legionaries. Peering through the morning mist, 4 Roman centurions spied a small but royally attired figure, standing easily upon a craft fashioned of a hollowed log. The figure was perhaps 30 meters from the centurions, and contrary to the laws of nature, seemed, despite the river's flow, to remain in a fixed position upon the water. The apparition was dressed in green and brown clothing with a cape of brilliant scarlet, the precise hue of many of the surrounding autumn leaves. One of the centurions shouted to the visitor, inquiring whether he was a friend or foe. He ordered his Scorpio-bearing soldiers to stand fast, to lower their bows, and to await further command. All listened intently for a response from the unexpected guest. In a steady, strong voice, a deep sound, one to be anticipated from a much larger man, the figure announced, "I would speak with the leader of your force." Although the language of the visitor was foreign to the Romans, they understood plainly what was being said. This amazed and chilled the most battle-hardened warriors among them. Hearing the request, however, the command centurion sent a messenger with all haste to the large four-sided tent-like enclosure situated 300 paces hence upon a rise. This was the field command headquarters of Tiberius. Tiberius, arriving upon the scene, was amazed at what he saw. In addition to the kingly figure, there were clearly visible now several hundred of his kinsmen on the far bank, intently observing the proceedings. Without hesitation, Tiberius asked the apparition who he was and what his mission might be. Having been thus addressed, the regal being announced, "My name is Celtric. I am king of the Elbe forest. I wish only to determine if you are spirit or flesh, of the light or of the darkness. I wish only to come ashore in safety. Touch your hand and look upon the light of your eyes." Tiberius, despite the protests of several of his personal guard, immediately granted the request. The warrior proceeded to drift toward the shore, and upon landing approached Tiberius. Celtric looked upon Tiberius, and Tiberius in turn gazed upon the most unusual personage he had ever encountered. Tiberius would later describe Celtic as, perhaps, the height of the back of a small pony. He possessed a broad chest, clearly that of a warrior, and his eyes were of hazel color, reminding me of an autumn's dawn. Celtric's face was regal, with balanced features, straight prominent nose and hair the color of October hay, but with a fine sheen which reflected the sun's light in a strange and unusual way. It was almost as if standing very near to Celtric on an autumn's afternoon within the woods. It would be difficult to see the outline, for the colors of his body, hair, and garments matched so closely with those offerings of nature in that climate and in that place. Upon ascertaining that Tiberius was indeed a man, the elf asked Tiberius what his heart's desire was. Tiberius shared with his guest the command of Augustus to discover additional lands for the empire. The elf king then told Tiberius that so long as the empire was just, they, the dwellers of the Elbe forest, welcomed new friends. With that, the elf king re-entered his craft and returned to the multitudes awaiting him. Once safely with his warriors, the elves seemed to Tiberius to simply melt into the forest. Never again did the Roman soldiers see or hear of the elves during the reign of Augustus. In a later time, when Roman rule became sore in that land, history tells us that 2 Roman legions were decimated by warriors generally befitting the description that Tiberius gave of the elves. They would appear at very inconvenient times from the woods, and their arrows were true to an almost otherworldly extent. To be struck by an elven arrow was to almost certainly suffer an injury most extreme.
It was June 15th, 2009. About 14 miles outside of Monroe, Louisiana, near a place called Rocky Branch, where I lived. My son and I were driving towards an old town called Farmville to get a Coke, and we were using my mother's truck, the gas gauge of which didn't work too well. We ran out of gas. We got out of the truck and began walking back towards Rocky Branch, and in the meantime, I called my husband to come pick us up as it was time for him to be getting out of work. The sun was just starting to set, but not dark out yet, more like shadowy, but you could still see everything real good. Anyway, we knew that we had to walk about 5 miles to get home, and on the way, we had to pass up these 3 huge garbage cans on the right side of the road, where all the locals hauled their own garbage to. We were walking along, basically grouching about our predicament. As we passed the garbage cans, we got the shock of our lives. It was this thing that looked just like a stupid troll out of a Dungeons and Dragons book. It was standing there eating out of the garbage can. It had a big, wide forehead, a long nose with wide nostrils, and a long, skinny chin. It had long white hair and big, huge eyes. It had a large torso, but skinny arms and legs. When it saw us, it crouched between the garbage cans, as if it did not want to be seen. My son took off running like a streak of lightning up the road, yelling, "What the heck is that?" He was 17 at that time. And me? Well, I was right behind him. All I could think of was, "Please don't chase us, whatever you are." My son and I were running like champs and hoping that the thing wasn't mean and that it wasn't following us, because as we walked on, it was getting darker and darker, and there were woods on both sides of us. Finally, my husband came and picked us up along the road after I called him on my cell phone. This story is no joke. This really happened. All I know is there are some strange beings out there that are as real as you and I are. Just how many, I don't know. But what I do know is that I'm not crazy, and I don't do drugs. I don't even drink, to be honest. What I saw was absolutely, beyond the shadow of a doubt, real.
In August of 1969, I was 16 years old at the time, and my brothers, sisters, and I were working in a huge lot where our house used to be. We were cleaning up all the weeds and garbage. This lot had an old wooden fence that bordered the whole area. It was noon, and under the shade of the only tree in the lot, we took our lunch break. I was sitting with my back against a tree eating my sandwich when suddenly something jumped through the opening in the fence down at the other end. It ran toward the center of the lot. At first I thought it was a rabbit, but on second glance it was a small person around 1 foot tall. I'm not even kidding. It had arms, legs, and a head that was wearing some kind of helmet. It was smiling as it ran. Unfortunately, in this town we have a lot of stray dogs, and there were 4 big dogs sleeping in the middle of the lot that woke up immediately as soon as the little figure came through the fence. Just like that, they started chasing the strange creature all around the lot. The poor thing was zigzagging, trying to keep a lead on the dogs, which it was. This little guy was fast. Its legs were like a blur. All of us were thinking the same thing at this time. We were hoping it would get away. All it had to do was head back towards the opening where it first came through, because the dogs were way too big to fit through it. Then this thing, this fairy, still smiling, turned around and started heading back towards that part of the fence. I was thinking, alright, it's going to make it, it's going to make it. And as it got closer, it made a giant leap towards the opening. But its aim was slightly off, and it hit the fence, which knocked it unconscious because it just fell to the ground. The dogs cut up and just tore it to pieces. My oldest brother threw rocks at the dog, but that did nothing. It was too late. The dogs were eating it. One of them trotted by us with the smiling head of the creature sticking out of its mouth. My poor sisters were traumatized. My brothers tried to make that dog drop that piece, but the dogs in one gulp swallowed it. I'll never forget it. And this really happened. I swear it. End of summer, 1985, at Buckingham Mountain, Buckingham, Pennsylvania. I saw a little person. I was riding horses with a friend, passing an area known as Wolf Rocks. The horses started acting a little odd, as if they were uneasy. I looked around to see what it could be. To my right, I saw this little person, about 1.5 feet tall. The floor of the woods had fallen leaves, and this guy had a hat on made of the same leaves. Either he was slightly dirty, or he had a real ruddy complexion. He was standing perfectly still. I believe he was trying to not be detected. When my brain finally wrapped around what I was seeing, after about 10 seconds, I said out loud, "I see you," at which point his eyes got big as if to say, "Oh shoot," and he ducked behind a fallen tree. He had a small roundish nose, round face, little mouth. I'm not sure what his shirt was made of, but it blended well with the forest floor. This is a true story. As mean as we are to one another at times, I can see why these little people would choose not to be known to us. Just imagine what sickos would do with these small humans. Make them servants, circus acts, etc. And much, much worse. I wonder if it's possible that dwarfism is somehow due to genetic race mixing with these people from long ago. Many people around Mexico and many other parts of the world claim to have seen elves, gnomes, or similar small humanoids. In Mexico, many people actually know them as el duendes, a little gnome or elf-like humanoid. Many of my close relatives have claimed to see the duende. This sighting took place in Guanajuato, Mexico. Their family was living at their mother's house, and weird things kept happening, like strange noises and things being stolen and misplaced. The oldest daughter said that at night, when she would wake up, she would walk into the kitchen and see elves scurrying away trying to hide. The little gnome-like creatures were about 6 to 14 inches tall. She said that she had caught them several times on the counter or tabletop stealing food that was left out. She described the elves as old, hairy, with long beards. They looked very poor and dirty. The little people wore clothes that looked like they were made from shirts and socks stitched together. Their clothes were old and tattered, sewn back together many times with patches and stitch marks all over them. Their clothes were also very dirty. These little people would scare her. They seemed to be more afraid of humans because of how frantically they tried to hide. The last time she saw a little person in the house, it was just standing by the refrigerator, unaware of her presence. Seeing the creature scared her back into her own room. Many years ago, I saw something that I can't scientifically explain. Some background information. I live in Beaverton, Oregon. There are still some areas on the outskirts here that have forests, farms, and the like. There is a road called Cornelius Pass, which is where this event occurred. Cornelius Pass is mainly a back road used for truckers or people looking for shortcuts. And I had a habit of driving that road at night, sort of a getaway from it all thing. I have always believed in the possibility of creatures not cataloged in science. I am skeptical but open-minded. I was driving one night with a friend of mine, and he was skeptical to the core. A person of pure science who did not believe in anything mysterious or unexplained. As I was rounding the corner on this dark night, my headlights caught something odd. I didn't see it as well as I would have liked as my eyes were on the road. What I did see was burned into my memory and has been there ever since. There was something on the side of the road that had been walking on its knuckles like a gorilla. It reared up and looked at us as the headlights hit it. It was about 4 feet tall, the size of a child. Its arms were long enough that when it stooped, it touched the ground, even though it was standing up. Its face, one of the images that remains hazy, I only remember as being incredibly ugly. It was wearing clothes and a pointed hat. I swear it, that's what got me when I saw it, what my mind focused on, a little pointed cone hat standing straight up, like a witch hat without a brim and smaller. The moment it saw us, it turned and shot into the grass on the side of the road, standing about 4.5 to 5 feet high. As it turned, I saw what I can only describe as a backpack. I slammed the car to a halt and turned to my friend, who was pale white and staring straight ahead in shock. "You saw it too?" I asked. He nodded. Now I've always been reckless, not caring about my safety when it comes to discovery. I put the car in reverse and started to back up. My friend screamed at the top of his lungs, "What in the heck do you think you're doing?" I screamed back, "Going after it." He slammed down his lock and reached over me, locking my door. "You are not getting out of the car," he said through gritted teeth. "Drive," he screamed. I didn't. Calmly looked at him and asked him what exactly he thought he saw. "A troll, a gnome or something, I don't care." Grumbling under my breath, I gave in to his fear and put the car in gear. I knew my friend had gotten a better look at it than I did, and afterwards I tried to ask him about it. He refused to talk about it again, or even acknowledge what had happened. I remember it though, clearly. I still wonder what it was, and if it's still out there. I have gone back looking at odd times, but haven't seen anything since.
So this happened during the month of August 2004. I was at a place called Pymatuning Park in Pennsylvania, picnicking with my family. I was 10. I'd wandered off alone into the nearby forest and was looking at all the trees. I was walking around when I heard the sound of music. I followed it until I reached a clearing. Like a scene from a movie, sitting on an old stump on the edge of the clearing was a little boy. He looked like he was about 7. He had medium-length blonde hair and was playing a recorder made of wood. He must have heard me because he looked up at me. He had pointed ears and dark green eyes. He looked at me and smiled. He asked me if I would play with him. His voice sounded really strange, almost like a bell. I told him I couldn't and had to get back to my family. He looked really sad for a minute, but then started smiling and told me it was okay, and he would wait until I could come play with him. Then he stood up and walked off into the forest. I've been back to that area several times. The clearing is still there, but the stump he was sitting on is long gone. The second or third time I went back, I left a slice of apple sitting near where the stump was. When I went back the next day, the apple was gone, and in its place was a very smooth stone.
Dan Borko's family moved to Wyandotte County, Kansas, to Liberty, Montana in 1948. When he was about 9 months old, his family didn't know it, but something already lived in the house on High Street. The house, a stucco bungalow built atop a hill in the 1920s, wasn't the only structure on that site. "There's a spring in the basement," Borko said. The site of the spring was the site of a large farm in 1860s through 1914. Our property was part of a farmyard at some time. A barn still sat outside the two-bedroom house when the Borkos moved there. In that house, in 1952, Borko saw something that has haunted his mind since. "I'll call him a troll, because that's what he reminded me of," Borko said. Regardless of the name, troll, gnome, dwarf, goblin, these diminutive, human-like earth creatures have littered cultural mythology across the globe and are known to approach and sometimes abduct children. Borko, 4 years old at the time, napped in the same room as his two younger brothers, both in cribs, when something roused him from his sleep. As his eyes slid open, he realized he and his baby brothers weren't alone. "I had just awakened from a nap and was rubbing my eyes and saw what you would call a troll," Borko said. "It was an old man with a long beard, large nose, about 3 feet tall, standing at the foot of my bed, and I was astounded." The little old man wore German lederhosen and held a smoking pipe in his hand. As the little old man stood looking at Borko, he smiled through his beard, winked, and disappeared through the closet door. "The only thing I could mutter was, 'Ghosts,'" Borko said. "My mother came in and opened the closet door, and on the top of the shelf was a toy rubber goose." Borko knows he didn't say goose. The word goss had something to do with the troll. Although Borko didn't think he saw the little man again, later in life his mother told him he often talked about someone no one else could see. "As a child, my mother said I had an imaginary friend, and I called it by its name," he said. "My mother said it sounded like a science fiction movie name." During this time, Borko remembers looking out his bedroom window at night and seeing people near the old barn in the backyard, little people. "That's what scared me," he said. "There were fairy tale pictures on my wall. There was a man in a mountain smoking a pipe, and this reminded me of him." As a child, Borko, now an artist with a master's degree in photography from Southern Illinois University, Cabindale, once tried to capture his little man on paper. "I remember doing a drawing of a picture of a man's face with large dark eyes," he said, "and my brother Bill started crying. Every time he saw it, he was out of his wits." Maybe Borko wasn't the only person in his house who saw the troll. He certainly wasn't the only person of that era who saw it. David Schwab, 52, grew up in Orange, New Jersey, and is familiar with the tales of a similar entity. His friend Jerry saw one of these trolls in the early 1960s. "I remember Jerry always talking about some kind of troll, elf, leprechaun type creature with a rather long beard being on his steps," Schwab said. Schwab met with Jerry in December 2009 before his friend moved to the Philippines and asked him about the story. He said that when he was a kid, he was in his backyard and was startled by a small gnome-like man with a long beard standing by his back porch, Schwab said. He said he had funny clothes on and a pointed hat and all. The entity, about 2 or 3 feet tall, just stood at the steps staring at him. This wasn't the last time a gnome made an appearance in Jerry's house. When Jerry was in his 20s, his 5-year-old nephew took a nap in a converted bedroom with his family called the shower room because it had once been a bathroom. A shower had still jutted from the wall. His nephew started crying and ran downstairs, Schwab said. He said that he was awoken by a small man with a long white beard that stood and looked at him. Now that's weird.
I live in Texas, and this happened just yesterday. I've never actually seen anything face to face, but I am familiar with stuff like this. I'm extremely interested in it, and I've always wanted to see things paranormal. Well, I got my wish. What happened was that I saw my dog chasing something. I figured it was my cat, so I went out there to yell at him. But when I got out there, I saw this thing at least a foot tall, in red clothes. Kind of like a clown suit without the big shoes and nose. He had a pointy red hat and a white beard. I got my dog to come to me. I pulled him inside and closed the door. I then looked out the window, and this thing was on my porch eating birdseed. We have a bird feeder next to our window. As I was looking out, this gnome looked straight at me. It got scared and hid behind my porch. I called out to it, and it peeked over the porch at me and smiled. Then it disappeared. That was the most amazing thing I've actually experienced, because I've always wanted to see fairy tale creatures like that.
Paul had an experience that took place in 1986 in Durban, South Africa, at the Mangrove Swamps Nature Reserve at approximately 6 p.m. On this day, Paul tells us he and 5 friends set off on a hike off the main trail in the swamp. We walked for about 10 minutes when the swamp gave way to a clearing with rock formation similar to that of a small natural amphitheater, he says. There were illuminated fire lights all around the amphitheater. Directly in front of me was a small person who was just over 3 feet tall in height. He looked directly at me and pointed at me in surprise. At this point, the entire group of friends had caught up to Paul. We looked around and witnessed little people sitting on the illuminated rock formation and others who were interacting with each other, he continues. The light and forms we saw were of an ethereal light, clearly less dense than the light we are familiar with. I estimated there to be between 20 and 30 of these little people. We were shocked and frightened by this phenomenon we experienced. The experience lasted only about 10 seconds for the friends, but seemed to play out as if it was in slow motion. We turned and ran as fast as we could towards our vehicle, Paul says. On arriving, we tried to make sense of what we witnessed. We returned to the spot and saw nothing but bush. No lights, no people, no rock formation, just bush.